Technically, I'm retired, but I'm engaged with many things. I'm on 3 publicly traded companies, 2 here in the U.S., a company called Aeroflex, and ATK, Alliant Tech Systems, also one that trades on the London Exchange, Cobham PLC. I'm also an advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and to Veritas Capital, an investment banking firm. I'm also vice chairman of the Defense Business Board, and then in my spare time, a trustee of a university and a charity, and I run a little consulting business. Let me summarize a little bit about what I talked about today in the keynote address to the Aerospace and Defense Conference. The theme of the conference, as you're probably aware, was strategic agility. I tended to focus not as much on the strategy side of that, but more on the agility side, specifically the need to match a company's culture to one's strategy and how to rapidly change company culture. Because the commonly held belief is it takes years to change a culture. In my own experience, there are specific steps that one can take to accelerate that process. So I went through the various steps. First, I covered very briefly my thoughts on strategy, because my own pet peeve is many strategies are simply aspirational statements. So they may be a goal, but they're so general that they might apply to almost any company, such as we wish to be world class. Who doesn't? So they're not specific enough, and they don't talk to the steps that a company needs to take to differentiate themselves in the marketplace.
So that's execution.
Right, so I particularly use the example of Southwest Airlines, who one of their tenets, one of the pillars of their strategy is to be best value, hence common fleet. But the way they emphasize the value in the public domain is no baggage fees, no change. When you change your airline reservation, no change fees. So they have something that actually sets them apart and helps advance their strategy. And clearly the bottom line reflects that. Then I went on to culture, starting with the first step of taking an inventory of what the culture is, but not by walking around and asking what's the culture like here, because nobody knows how to answer that question. I went through a series of questions like, what's it like to work here? What's the informal system? What's the formal system? How does information flow within this organization? How does misinformation flow within the organization? And questions of that ilk that are a little more provocative, and you get people to actually start talking about, people at all levels start to talk about what's this place really like. To change a culture, I think the first thing one needs to decide is what do you have? What's your strategy? Again, let me give a couple of examples. If your strategy, like Southwest Airlines, everybody cooperates, that's the way you have these friendly people facing the public, then you need to have a culture where people actually are working together. If, on the other hand, you're running a car dealership or a series of car dealerships, maybe you actually want to foster competition. The best salesman gets a big bonus every month. The best dealership gets the reward every month. And there's much less emphasis on cooperation and much more emphasis on cooperation. If you're running a power plant, you better have an emphasis in your culture of risk adverse. If you're running an entrepreneurial banking business that gives venture capital to startups, you better have a high tolerance of risk, or you're not going to be very successful. So it's not a question of what's a successful culture or what isn't a successful culture. It's more a question of what culture do you have, what do you need to advance your strategy, and then what are the levers to affect that change. I think the most effective lever is ultimately a compelling case with clarity made to the people. How do you get their hearts and minds? And the way you do that is to have something that is quite specific, as I previously mentioned, but also realistic, and then some early successes. So if a strategy, for example, as Wharton is trying to do, advance in the international marketplace, they better start to devote some real resources, have some tangible things, some early successes, so there's credibility. around the internationalization of the business. People start to see more, you're recruiting more heavily overseas and possibly domestically. And those kinds of specific steps actually get people to say, this isn't just rhetoric. The management of this institution is serious about doing this, and I'm starting to see, so maybe there's something I can do. I have a friend in China or India. Maybe I can talk to them about coming here to school. Well, I'll give you an example in one of my early experiences when I was one of the first jobs I had as president of about a $200 million company. And this was a company in crisis, hence they brought in a new president. They weren't making money and were losing market share. But the most frequent manifestation when I did the cultural inventory was they were going from crisis. Management was spending most of their time solving problems, crisis to crisis to crisis. As a matter of fact, they described themselves as, we're always putting out fires. So I came up with a theme of as a matter of fact, the first management meeting, I actually came out in a fireman's outfit, complete with a captain's hat, chief's hat, and an axe. It actually got a pretty good laugh. And then I made the point, we've got to go from firefighting to fire prevention, more to Smokey the Bear. But it wasn't just that theme. I had some underlying specifics behind, here's the steps that we've got to take in order to affect that change. Still took a year to really turn the company around. I actually didn't have to make very many changes in the people. They just needed to kind of think in a new paradigm. With regard to the aerospace and defense environment, admittedly the economy is improving, but one of the points that I made is business as usual in aerospace and defense is going to be very unusual going forward. On the defense side, we've had a 10-year wonderful period of increasing budgets. I don't think there's very many people around to think that that's going to continue. Some talk about a stair step downward, but more likely we may have a bit of a slide going downward. And anybody who's been in a roller coaster knows when you go over that top and start going down, you get this bad feeling in the pit of your stomach, and that's going to cause change. On the aerospace side, we're seeing certainly growth, and probably continued growth as the economy improves. But the big change there is, whereas the international market with great customers, they're about to become great competitors. China's talking about building an airplane. India's talking about building an airplane. So the competitive environment may well change. You just have to look at the automobile industry and what happened to General Motors and Chrysler and Ford. The dominant players, U.S. market, foreign competition came in. It's a different world today. I don't have a crystal ball as to what's going to happen in M&A, but I would suspect that this is a continuing process. I think the government is starting to send some signals that they would be less happy now that the big guys are as big as they are. They'd probably be less happy about consolidation at that level. And they'll still be reviewing everything on a case-by-case basis. But I don't believe they will try to thwart what's typically gone on at the lower levels, more consolidation. But remember, every time there's consolidation, that also creates opportunities for new startups. There's always people leaving these big companies or getting out of college, starting their own companies. So it's like in almost every industry, it's a continuing evolution. I don't see that materially changing over the next decade compared with the last decade. For those who can, obviously in some of the defense business, China is still considered, on the other side of the fence, and there's going to be very limited cooperation and very limited either selling or partnering. On the aerospace side, and some of the companies I'm working with, most of the companies look to China as this huge market, which it is, and have decided that they need to do it in a partnership basis. So finding or establishing or transferring technology consistent with our export regulations and developing partners in China. has proven to be very successful both in addressing the market and, frankly, in also helping to address the U.S. market, because there's no question that they have capability, lower cost capability in many segments of what they can do. I tend to look backward, those who, the office said, if you ignore history, you are destined to repeat it. If you look, 5 years in that cycle is a relatively short period of time, but if you look at longer, look at the great world powers, going all the way back to Egypt, Greece, Rome, more recently the United Kingdom, and now the U.S. One of the things that tends to happen is they don't last forever. I know that sounds very un-American, but they don't last forever. They tend to frequently lose their way, and the cycle time gets shorter and shorter and shorter. So we as Americans, and we in the U.S., better recognize that China, India, certainly as two examples, they are going to, the current club of one is going to expand. Hopefully we'll still be a great country and a great economic power and a great world power, but we're not going to be alone. Hopefully it won't be adversarial the way it was us in the Soviet Union. It's going to be something quite different. But I don't see it as being the U.S. and nobody else closely on our heels. I think inevitably China will be there as a more equal partner going forward. And you see many people recognizing that, both on the industrial side and the political side, starting all the way back with Nixon, who, started to open the door.